As he passed by the young flower seller, the millionaire froze when he saw her pendant, the same one he had given to his beloved many years ago. The streets of Chicago were alive with their usual symphony of bustling commuters, honking horns, and the rhythmic clatter of train wheels above. Yet for Mr. Charles Whitaker, the vibrancy of the city felt muted. The man who had once dominated the financial world, amassing a fortune that could sustain lifetimes, now walked the streets as just another figure among the crowd. His tailored overcoat and polished shoes hinted at wealth, but the slow, deliberate way he moved told another story. A man carrying the weight of regret. The crisp winter air bit at his cheeks as he strolled along Michigan Avenue, though he hardly noticed. His thoughts, as they often did, wandered to his daughter, Emily. The same question played on a loop in his mind. What could I have done differently? The answer always eluded him. Though the memories of their final argument were vivid, he could still see the fire in Emily's eyes as she shouted at him, accusing him of trying to control her life. "You've built walls around me, Dad, and I can't breathe," she had said before walking out. That was the last time he saw her. No calls, no letters, just silence. Whitaker had thrown himself into his work after she left, hoping that success might drown out the ache of her absence. But as the years passed, and his accomplishments began to feel hollow, the loneliness became inescapable. Now retired, with no meetings to distract him and no one to share his lavish penthouse, his days felt as gray and empty as the Chicago sky. Turning down a quieter path, Whitaker found himself at Millennium Park, his usual refuge from the monotony of his solitude. The faint hum of distant carolers mixed with the crunch of snow underfoot, but something different caught his attention. Ahead, by a small stand near the park's fountain, a young man was arranging bouquets of flowers. His hands moved quickly but with care, adjusting petals here, snipping stems there. There was a quiet focus to his work that intrigued Whitaker, and before he realized it, his steps had carried him closer. The young man looked up as Whitaker approached, his brown eyes warm but cautious. He was in his early 20s, perhaps, with a mop of dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His clothes were simple, worn jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, but there was an air of dignity about him. "Good afternoon, sir," the young man greeted, his voice polite but reserved. "Looking for something special?" Whitaker glanced at the flowers. Roses, daisies, and lilies arranged in modest but thoughtful bouquets. The scent of fresh blooms mingled with the crisp air, creating a surprising sense of warmth despite the cold. "These are quite lovely," Whitaker said, though his focus wasn't entirely on the flowers. Something about the boy's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he spoke, tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," the young man replied, offering a shy smile. "Flowers have a way of making people smile, even on hard days." Whitaker nodded absently, his gaze lingering on the vendor's neck. A thin silver chain peeked out from beneath his sweater, and dangling from it was a small, intricate locket. His breath caught. He knew that locket. It was identical to the one he had given Emily on her 16th birthday. "May I ask?" Whitaker began, his voice steady but curious. "Where did you get that pendant?" The young man's hand instinctively went to the locket, his expression shifting to one of guardedness. "It was my mother's," he said simply. "She gave it to me before she passed away." Whitaker's pulse quickened, though he worked to keep his composure. "I see. My apologies if the question was intrusive, it's just a beautiful piece." The vendor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yeah, it's the only thing I have left of her. Really, that and a few stories from the woman who raised me." "Raised you?" Whitaker pressed gently. The young man nodded. "I lost my parents when I was a kid. An older lady took me in. She didn't have much, but she gave me a home." Whitaker's heart raced. The resemblance, the locket, the timeline. It all pointed to one possibility. Could this boy be? No, it was too much of a coincidence. And yet, the thought took root. "You've done well for yourself," Whitaker said after a pause. "It's not easy making a living in this city." The young man shrugged with a modest smile. "You just have to keep going, even when it's tough." Whitaker nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragments of the past with the clues he had just uncovered. He bought a modest bouquet of white lilies, handing over far more than their worth, and walked away with his thoughts swirling as he made his way back to his penthouse, clutching the flowers. Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered a piece of Emily. The boy's features, his quiet resilience. It was as though she were standing in front of him again. And that locket. It couldn't be a coincidence. For the first time in years, Whitaker felt something other than regret stirring in his chest. It was hope. A faint, fragile thing, but enough to set his mind racing with possibilities. The next day, Charles Whitaker found himself standing at the same spot in Millennium Park, just steps away from the young flower vendor's stand. The air was brisk, and the occasional gust of wind sent chills down his spine. But he barely noticed. His focus was on the boy, who was already arranging his display for the day. Whitaker hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something about the boy lingered in his thoughts long after he had returned to his penthouse the previous evening. The locket, the resemblance, the way he spoke. Each detail replayed in his mind like pieces of a puzzle demanding to be solved. This time, Whitaker approached the stand with more purpose. The boy looked up as he neared, his polite but wary smile returning. "Good morning, sir," the boy greeted, brushing a stray lock of hair out of his eyes. "Back for more flowers," Whitaker chuckled softly, his breath visible in the chilly air. "You could say that. You have quite the eye for arrangements. It's hard not to come back." The boy's smile widened slightly, this time tinged with pride. "Thank you. I try to keep them simple. People like simple." Whitaker nodded, his gaze drifting over the bouquets. "What do you recommend today?" "Well," the boy began, leaning forward slightly as he gestured to the selection. "If it's for someone special, these roses are always a safe choice. But if you're looking for something different, these sunflowers are great, bright, cheerful." Whitaker hesitated, then pointed to a modest bouquet of roses. "I'll take these, classic like you said." The boy quickly wrapped the flowers in crisp white paper, tying them with a delicate ribbon. "Here you go," he said, handing them over. "That'll be $15. Whitaker handed him a 20. "Keep the change," he said, watching the boy's reaction carefully. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate it." The boy tucked the bill into a small tin on the counter, his movements quick and efficient. Whitaker lingered for a moment, holding the flowers but not quite ready to leave. "You mentioned yesterday that your mother gave you that pendant," he said casually, nodding toward the silver chain around the boy's neck. "Do you mind if I ask more about her?" The boy's expression grew distant for a moment, and he ran a finger over the locket. "She died when I was little," he said softly. "I don't remember much about her, to be honest. Just a few flashes. Her smile, the way she used to hum when she cooked. She wore this every day. Though, said it was her lucky charm." Whitaker's heart clenched. "And your father?" he asked gently. "Never knew him," the boy replied, his tone neutral. "It was just me and my mom for as long as I can remember. After she passed, well, life got a little complicated." Whitaker studied him, his chest tightening with a mix of empathy and unease. The boy's answers only deepened the questions swirling in his mind. "I'm sorry to hear that," Whitaker said finally. "It sounds like you've been through a lot." The boy shrugged. "It's life. You just keep going, right? Anyway," he added, clearly trying to shift the focus. "What about you buying flowers for someone special?" Whitaker hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. "Not exactly," he said after a moment. "Let's just say they remind me of someone I used to know." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response. "Well, whoever it is, I hope they like them." Whitaker managed a faint smile, but his mind was already elsewhere. The more he learned about the boy, the more certain he felt that this wasn't just coincidence. But how could he be sure? The resemblance was undeniable, and the story of the locket aligned far too closely with Emily's. Yet Whitaker couldn't shake the fear of being wrong. What if this was just his guilt playing tricks on him later that afternoon? Whitaker sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The bouquet of roses lay on his desk, a bittersweet reminder of the day's encounter. He couldn't let this go. If the boy was truly Emily's son, his grandson, then he had a responsibility to him. But how could he approach something so delicate? How could he ask questions without scaring him off? Reaching for the phone, Whitaker dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "James Miller," he said, when the line connected. "It's Charles Whitaker. I need your help." Miller was one of the best private investigators in the city, known for his discretion and thoroughness. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. I need you to look into someone, Whitaker continued. A young man. He works at a flower stand in Millennium Park. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Miller responded, What's the connection? Whitaker hesitated, his hand tightening around the receiver. I'm not sure yet, he admitted, but I think he might be my grandson. The words felt heavy as they left his mouth, but they also carried a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, Whitaker felt like he was taking a step toward something meaningful, something that could finally fill the void Emily had left behind. As he hung up the phone, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, staring at the locket now resting in his mind's eye. The investigation would take time, but he was willing to wait. After all, if there was even the smallest chance that the boy was his grandson, he owed it to Emily, and to himself, to find out the truth. Charles Whitaker sat in his study that evening, the city lights casting a faint glow through the large floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind raced as he replayed the day's encounter with the young flower vendor. The boy's face, his voice, the way he carried himself, it all tugged at a thread deep within Whitaker, pulling him into a flood of memories he had tried and failed to suppress. Emily, he could still see her as a child, her bright eyes full of curiosity as she peppered him with endless questions about the world. Why is the sky blue? She'd ask. Or, how do birds know where to go when they fly south? Her inquisitiveness had always been a source of pride for him, a sign of her intelligence and potential. But as she grew older, her questions changed. Why can't I make my own decisions? She'd demanded at 16. Why do you always have to control everything? Whitaker's grip on his whiskey glass tightened. He had only wanted the best for her. That was what he told himself back then, and it was the same justification he clung to now. But deep down, he knew the truth. His relentless drive for perfection, the same ambition that had built his financial empire, had also built walls around Emily. Walls so high that eventually, she felt she had no choice but to escape. He sipped his drink, the warmth doing little to ease the chill of regret that settled in his chest. His last memory of Emily was etched into his mind like a scar. She had stood in the foyer of their grand home, a suitcase by her side, her face a mixture of anger and heartbreak. I can't do this anymore, Dad, she had said, her voice trembling. I need to live my own life, even if that means without you. And then she was gone. For years, he had held on to hope that she might call, might send a letter, might show up at his door one day. But as the silence stretched on, hope gave way to bitterness, and bitterness gave way to an aching void that nothing, not his wealth, not his accolades, could fill now, decades later. The possibility that Emily's son might be out there, standing by that flower stand in Millennium Park, was almost too much for Whitaker to comprehend. He leaned back in his chair, the pendant around the boy's neck flashing in his memory. It had to mean something. Emily had loved that locket, a gift he had given her on her 16th birthday. She had worn it every day until she left. How could it have ended up with that boy if not through her? The soft buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. Picking it up, he saw a text from James Miller, starting the investigation. We'll update soon. Whitaker stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone down. He trusted Miller to do his job, but the waiting was agonizing. He needed answers. Needed to know if this boy was truly a link to Emily, to the family he had lost. The following morning, Whitaker returned to the park. Clutching his overcoat tightly against the crisp air, he hadn't planned on coming back so soon, but something about the boy drew him in, like a moth to a flame. The flower stand was already set up, and the boy was busy arranging a bouquet of sunflowers. His movements were quick yet deliberate, and Whitaker couldn't help but admire the quiet determination in his demeanor. It reminded him of Emily in her younger years, how she would focus so intently on her art projects, completely oblivious to the world around her. Good morning, Whitaker greeted as he approached. The boy looked up, flashing a polite smile. Morning, sir. Back again. Seems like I can't stay away, Whitaker replied with a chuckle. Your flowers are hard to resist. The boy laughed softly. Well, that's the idea, I guess. Whitaker's gaze fell on the pendant again. He wanted to ask more about it, to press for details, but he knew he had to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was to scare the boy off. Do you ever get tired of this work? He asked instead. Gesturing to the flowers, the boy shrugged. It's not always easy, but I like it. It's honest work, and it makes people happy. That's more than I can say for some jobs." Whitaker nodded, his respect for the boy growing with every word. "You have a good head on your shoulders," he said. "That's rare these days." The boy smiled, though a flicker of sadness passed through his eyes. "I guess you just learn to keep going, no matter what life throws at you." Whitaker felt a pang of guilt. Had Emily taught him that resilience? Had her absence forced him to grow up too soon? The thought was almost too much to bear. "Well," Whitaker said after a moment, pulling out his wallet, "I'll take that bouquet of sunflowers." The boy quickly wrapped the flowers, his hand steady despite the chill in the air. "Here you go, sir, and thank you for coming back. It means a lot." Whitaker managed a faint smile as he accepted the bouquet. "You'll be seeing more of me," he said, his voice carrying a weight he hoped the boy wouldn't notice. As he walked away, the sunflowers bright against the gray cityscape. Whitaker's mind churned with possibilities. The boy's story, his demeanor, the pendant, it all pointed to a connection. But how could he confirm it without scaring him off? The answers felt just out of reach, like a puzzle with one missing piece. For the first time in years, Whitaker felt something stir in him, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he had been given a second chance. Charles Whitaker sat in his study, the soft hum of the city faintly audible through the thick glass windows. On his desk lay the bouquet of sunflowers he had purchased earlier that day, their bright yellow petals a stark contrast to the dark wood. Yet, his thoughts were far from the vibrant flowers. They circled back to the boy, the pendant, and the unanswered questions that gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his reverie. It was a text from James Miller, the investigator he had hired. "I've started looking into the boy. We'll contact you with updates soon." Whitaker exhaled slowly, placing the phone back on the desk. He trusted Miller. He had used the man's services in the past, always with results. But this time, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't a business deal or a legal dispute. This was personal. What if the boy really is my grandson? The thought sent a surge of hope through him, quickly tempered by the fear of what he might find. And what if he isn't? The next morning, Whitaker found himself at his usual spot in Millennium Park, the air crisp and cold as sunlight broke through the gray clouds. The boy was already at his stand, arranging bouquets with the same quiet focus Whitaker had observed before. Today, the vendor wore a thick scarf wrapped around his neck, but the familiar glint of the silver locket still caught Whitaker's eye. "Morning, sir," the boy greeted as Whitaker approached. "Back for more flowers." Whitaker smiled faintly. "I suppose I'm becoming a regular." The boy chuckled. "Well, I can't complain about that. What are you in the mood for today?" Whitaker gestured toward a bouquet of mixed wildflowers. "Those will do nicely, bright and uncomplicated." As the boy wrapped the bouquet, Whitaker decided to press just a little further. "You've mentioned your mother a few times. She must have been someone very special." The boy paused for a moment, his expression softening. I don't remember her much, but the people who knew her always said she was kind, strong too. She worked hard, even when things weren't easy." Whitaker nodded, his chest tightening at the boy's words. Emily had been strong too. Stubborn, driven, determined to live life on her own terms. It was a trait he had admired in her, even when it clashed with his own desire to guide her. "And the woman who raised you," Whitaker continued. "She must have done a good job." The boy smiled. "Yeah, she did. She didn't have much, but she always made sure I had what I needed. I owe her a lot." Whitaker felt a pang of guilt. Had Emily struggled after leaving? Had she lived in poverty while he remained surrounded by luxury? The thought was almost unbearable. The boy handed him the wrapped bouquet, his smile polite but genuine. "Here you go, sir. Hope they brighten your day." Whitaker accepted the flowers, hesitating for a moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You're a good young man. Your mother would be proud." The boy's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face before he nodded. "Thanks," he said softly. "That means a lot." Later that afternoon, Whitaker's phone rang. He answered quickly, recognizing Miller's number. "I've got some preliminary findings," Miller said, his tone brisk but professional. "The boy's name is Matthew Carter, 22 years old, raised by a woman named Helen Carter, who took him in after his mother passed. No record of the father. Whitaker's grip on the phone tightened. And his mother. She passed away in a house fire about 15 years ago, Miller continued. Helen told neighbors that Matthew's mother was a single parent. She didn't leave much behind, but Helen held on to a few personal items, including that locket the boy wears. Whitaker's breath caught. Did you find her name? There was a brief pause on the line. Her name was Emily, Miller said finally. Emily Whitaker. Whitaker closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him like a tidal wave. It was her, his daughter, his Emily. She was gone, but she had left behind a son, a grandson he had never known existed. Are you certain? Whitaker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Positive, Miller replied. I cross-checked the details. It all lines up. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, the room spinning slightly around him. He had spent years regretting the loss of his daughter, only to discover that a part of her still existed, standing just a few feet away from him in Millennium Park. What do you want me to do next? Miller asked. Whitaker hesitated. He wanted to rush to the boy, to tell him everything, to claim him as family, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Matthew didn't know him. To the boy, he was just another customer, a stranger who bought flowers and asked too many questions. Nothing yet, Whitaker said finally. I need time to figure out how to handle this. Understood, Miller replied. Let me know if you need anything else. After ending the call, Whitaker sat in silence, the weight of the truth settling heavily on his shoulders. He had a grandson, a living connection to Emily, but the road to building a relationship with him was fraught with uncertainty. How could he bridge the gap between their lives? How could he make up for all the years they had lost? As the sun dipped below the horizon, Whitaker stared out at the city, his heart a mixture of grief and hope. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation for Charles Whitaker. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, hoping it would be James Miller with more details about Matthew. Despite the confirmation of Emily's connection to the boy, Whitaker's mind refused to settle. Questions piled upon one another. Why didn't she reach out? Why did she have to struggle alone? Did she ever think about coming back? The weight of those thoughts clung to him as he made his way once again to Millennium Park. It was becoming a routine he hadn't planned but couldn't avoid. Each visit felt like a thread tying him closer to Matthew. Though the boy remained blissfully unaware of the truth, that morning, the park was alive with its usual rhythm. Joggers moving briskly along the paths, families laughing as they admired the frost-dusted sculptures, and street performers playing familiar holiday tunes. But Whitaker's focus was singular, as, drawn once again to the modest flower stand near the fountain, Matthew was there, as always, bundled in a thick jacket and scarf against the chill. He was carefully arranging a display of bright red roses, his hands moving with a practiced ease that Whitaker had come to admire. There was a quiet determination about him, a resilience that reminded Whitaker so much of Emily. "Good morning, sir," Matthew called out as Whitaker approached. "Back for more flowers." Whitaker smiled faintly. "I suppose I've become something of a regular, haven't I?" Matthew chuckled. "Nothing wrong with that. Keeps me in business." Whitaker's gaze swept over the stand, though his mind was far from the flowers. "How's business been?" he asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of genuine curiosity. "Not bad," Matthew replied. "The holidays help. People want something cheerful this time of year, I guess." Whitaker nodded, his eyes lingering on Matthew's face. There was a familiarity there that he couldn't ignore. The curve of his jaw, the way his eyes lit up when he smiled. It was like seeing echoes of Emily in every movement. But the locket around his neck was what truly held Whitaker's attention. That small piece of silver, a gift he had given Emily so long ago, now resting against the chest of a boy who had no idea who he was. "Do you ever think about expanding?" Whitaker asked suddenly. Matthew blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Expanding?" "Yes," Whitaker continued, his tone thoughtful. "A bigger stand perhaps, or even your own shop." Matthew hesitated, his expression shifting to one of cautious interest. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "It's kind of a dream of mine, to have a little flower shop one day. Something small but cozy, you know, a place where people can come in, smell the flowers, and leave with a smile." Whitaker smiled at the earnestness in his voice. "It's a good dream," he said, "and I'm sure you'll make it happen." Matthew shrugged, though there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Maybe one day, for now, though. I've got to stick to what I can manage. Whitaker nodded, sensing the boy's hesitation. It was clear that Matthew was used to doing things on his own, relying on no one but himself. It was a trait Whitaker admired, but also one that filled him with a pang of guilt. If he had been there, if he had known about Matthew sooner, would things have been different? Later that afternoon, Whitaker received another call from James Miller. He answered quickly, his voice steady despite the nervous energy bubbling beneath the surface. "I've got some more information," Miller said. "You were right about the boy. His name's Matthew Carter, but he was born Matthew Whitaker. Emily listed you as the father on his birth certificate." Whitaker's chest tightened at the mention of his name on the document. It was undeniable now. This wasn't just a suspicion or a coincidence. Matthew was his grandson. He was born in a small town just outside of Chicago, Miller continued. Emily moved there after she left home. She worked odd jobs, mostly at diners and shops, to support herself and Matthew. Neighbors remember her as hardworking but private. She didn't talk much about her past. Whitaker closed his eyes, the image of Emily struggling to make ends meet cutting him deeply. She had been so proud, so determined to prove she could make it on her own. And she had, until tragedy struck. "What about the fire?" Whitaker asked quietly. "It was an accident," Miller said. "Faulty wiring in the house she was renting. She managed to get Matthew out, but she didn't make it. Helen Carter, the woman who raised Matthew, was a neighbor. She took him in after Emily passed." Whitaker's grip on the phone tightened. The thought of Emily dying alone, with no one there to help her, was almost too much to bear. But the fact that she had saved Matthew, risked everything to ensure he lived, was a testament to her strength and love. "Does Matthew know any of this?" Whitaker asked. "Not much," Miller replied. "Helen didn't have many details, and Emily never shared much about her family. As far as Matthew's concerned, you don't exist." Whitaker exhaled slowly, the weight of those words settling heavily on his chest. He had spent years mourning the loss of his daughter, only to discover that a part of her had survived. But how could he bridge the gap between their lives? How could he build a relationship with a grandson who didn't even know his name? "Thank you, Miller," Whitaker said finally. "I'll handle it from here." As he hung up the phone, Whitaker stared out at the city skyline, his thoughts a chaotic mix of grief, hope, and determination. For the first time in years, he had a purpose, a chance to make things right. But how? That question loomed over him like a storm cloud. The answer just out of reach. The next morning, Charles Whitaker stood by the window of his penthouse, gazing out at the bustling city below. His thoughts were a tangled web of guilt, hope, and uncertainty. He had spent the last few days learning about Matthew, piecing together the fragments of his daughter Emily's life through the lens of her son. But even with all the information James Miller had uncovered, Whitaker felt the weight of one pressing question. How do I approach him? For now, he chose to do what he had been doing. Visit the flower stand, talk to Matthew, and learn more about him. It was a small step, but it was all he could manage without risking scaring the boy away. With that thought in mind, he slipped on his coat, grabbed his scarf, and made his way to Millennium Park. When Whitaker arrived, the stand was already open, with Matthew in the middle of arranging a new display of flowers. The boy seemed brighter today, his smile a little more genuine, his movements more relaxed. Whitaker approached with his usual steady stride, and Matthew looked up, his face lighting up with recognition. "Morning, sir," Matthew called. "Back again." Whitaker chuckled softly. "It's becoming a habit, isn't it?" "Nothing wrong with that," Matthew replied, his hands deftly tying a ribbon around a bouquet of daisies. "So, what can I get you today?" Whitaker glanced over the selection, though his focus wasn't on the flowers. "Those tulips look nice," he said, pointing to a small arrangement near the corner of the stand. "Great choice," Matthew said, picking up the bouquet and wrapping it carefully as he worked. Whitaker decided to nudge the conversation toward something he had been curious about. "You mentioned the other day that opening a flower shop is a dream of yours," Whitaker began. "Have you ever thought about how you'd do it?" Matthew glanced up, surprised by the question. "I mean, yeah, I've thought about it," he said, his tone cautious. "It's one of those someday things, you know, when I have enough saved up. If I ever have enough saved up. Whitaker nodded thoughtfully. What would it look like? Your shop, I mean. Matthew's face softened, and for a moment, a spark of excitement flickered in his eyes. Small and cozy, he said, his voice taking on a more animated tone. Maybe with big windows so people walking by can see all the flowers inside. I'd have different sections. Roses, lilies, wildflowers, and a little corner with potted plants. Oh, and a seating area where people could sit and read or just enjoy the smell of fresh flowers. Whitaker listened intently, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It sounds wonderful, he said. You clearly have a vision. Matthew shrugged, the spark dimming slightly. It's just a dream for now, something to work toward. Whitaker's heart ached at the boy's modesty. It was clear that Matthew had learned to temper his expectations, to dream cautiously in a world that had likely taught him not to hope too much. But Whitaker saw potential in him, potential that deserved a chance to flourish. Well, Whitaker said, handing over payment for the tulips, I think you have what it takes to make it happen? Matthew smiled, though there was a hint of skepticism in his expression. Thanks, sir. That means a lot. That afternoon, Whitaker sat in his study, the bouquet of tulips resting in a vase on the corner of his desk. He couldn't stop thinking about Matthew's dream, the way his face had lit up when he described his ideal flower shop. It was a simple dream, yet to Whitaker, it represented so much more. It was a glimpse of Emily's spirit in her son, a reminder of the strength and creativity that had defined her. The phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was James Miller. Any updates? Whitaker asked, answering quickly. Not much more to add, Miller replied. But I did find one thing that might interest you, Helen Carter. The woman who raised Matthew left him a small inheritance when she passed. It's not much, but he's been using it to keep himself afloat while running the flower stand. Whitaker nodded, absorbing the information. Thank you, Miller. I'll let you know if I need anything else. After ending the call, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. Matthew had a dream, but he lacked the resources to make it a reality. Whitaker, on the other hand, had more resources than he could ever use. The solution seemed obvious, yet he knew he had to approach it carefully. Matthew was proud and independent, traits that Whitaker respected. If he wanted to help, he couldn't be heavy-handed. An idea began to take shape, one that filled Whitaker with a quiet sense of purpose. He reached for his notebook and began to jot down notes, sketching out a plan to support Matthew in a way that would feel natural, almost serendipitous. It would take time and subtlety, but Whitaker was willing to invest both. As the evening wore on, Whitaker found himself smiling, a rare, genuine smile that hadn't graced his face in years, for the first time in what felt like forever. He had something to look forward to, not just for himself, but for Matthew, for Emily's legacy. And as he stared at the bouquet of tulips on his desk, Whitaker silently vowed that he wouldn't let this opportunity slip away. He had been given a second chance, and he intended to make the most of it. Charles Whitaker arrived at Millennium Park earlier than usual the next morning. The sun had barely risen, and the park was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of joggers and tourists yet to begin. Whitaker's breath fogged in the crisp air as he made his way to the flower stand, which was already partially set up. Matthew stood behind it, arranging fresh bouquets, his movements unhurried but precise. Morning, sir, Matthew greeted, glancing up with a faint smile. You're early today. Whitaker returned the smile, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. I had some time to spare. Thought I'd stop by before the rush. Matthew nodded, continuing his work. Well, you picked a good time. These flowers are as fresh as they get. Whitaker stepped closer, taking in the vibrant colors of the arrangements. Today, the stand featured a mix of roses, tulips, and carnations, each bouquet tied with simple ribbons that gave them a touch of charm. You've got a real knack for this, Whitaker said, genuinely impressed. It's not just arranging flowers, it's an art. Matthew chuckled, a little bashful. Thanks. I guess I've always liked working with my hands. There's something satisfying about creating something people enjoy. Whitaker nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever considered taking classes? Learning more about floral design or running a business? Matthew paused, setting down the bouquet he was working on. I've thought about it, he admitted, but classes cost money. And I've got to focus on keeping this stand going. Maybe someday? Whitaker's chest tightened at the boy's practicality. Matthew clearly had ambition, but life had taught him to temper it with caution. Whitaker admired his resilience but couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. If he had been there, if he had known about Matthew earlier, perhaps the boy wouldn't have to carry so much on his own. You know, Whitaker said carefully, there are scholarships for things like that. Grants, too. You might be able to find support if you're interested. Matthew looked at him, a hint of curiosity in his expression. Maybe, he said after a moment. I'd have to look into it. Right now, though. I'm just trying to get through the winter. Whitaker nodded, sensing that it wasn't the right time to push further. Instead, he reached for a bouquet of carnations. I'll take these today, he said, handing Matthew the payment. Thanks, sir, Matthew replied, wrapping the flowers with practiced ease. You're keeping me in business. Whitaker smiled faintly, accepting the bouquet. It's a pleasure. That afternoon, Whitaker sat at his desk, the carnations arranged neatly in a vase beside him. His conversation with Matthew lingered in his mind, particularly the boy's cautious optimism. It was clear that Matthew had dreams, but he was hesitant to chase them fully. Whitaker understood why. Life hadn't given him many reasons to trust that things would work out, but Whitaker was determined to change that. He reached for his notebook, flipping to a page where he had started sketching out ideas for helping Matthew. He didn't want to overwhelm the boy or make him feel like a charity case. Whatever he did had to feel natural, like an opportunity rather than a handout. The first step, he decided, was to learn more about the logistics of running a flower shop. Whitaker had no experience in the field, but he knew how to run a business. If he could combine his knowledge with Matthew's passion, they might just be able to make the boy's dream a reality. Picking up the phone, Whitaker called James Miller. James, I need you to do something for me, he said, when the investigator answered. Find out what it would take to open a small flower shop in the city. Permits, costs, anything else we'd need to know. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Miller responded. You planning on going into the flower business, Charles? Whitaker chuckled softly. Not quite. Let's just say I'm helping someone with a dream. Understood, Miller said. I'll get back to you with the details. After ending the call, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, feeling a rare sense of purpose. Helping Matthew wasn't just about making amends for the past. It was about honoring Emily's memory and ensuring her son had a chance to thrive. For the first time in years, Whitaker felt like he was doing something meaningful. Over the next few days, Whitaker continued his routine visits to the flower stand, each time learning a little more about Matthew. The boy was guarded at first, but as they talked more, his walls began to lower. Whitaker discovered that Matthew loved reading, particularly books about nature and history. He had a dry sense of humor that caught Whitaker off guard, but always made him smile. And though he rarely spoke about his struggles, it was clear that Matthew had faced more challenges in his young life than most people ever would. One morning, as Whitaker handed Matthew his usual payment, the boy hesitated. You don't have to keep buying flowers every day, Matthew said, his tone light but sincere. I appreciate it, but I don't want you to feel like you have to. Whitaker smiled, touched by the boy's honesty. I buy them because I want to, he said simply, and because they brighten my day. Matthew studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, as long as it's your choice. It is, Whitaker assured him. And besides, it's good practice for when you open that shop of yours. Matthew laughed softly, shaking his head. You're pretty persistent. You know that. Whitaker's smile widened. It's a habit of mine. As he walked away, Whitaker felt a sense of progress. Slowly but surely, he was building a connection with Matthew, one that he hoped would eventually lead to trust. And as the winter wind swept through the park, Whitaker clutched the flowers a little tighter, knowing he was one step closer to making things right. Charles Whitaker's routine of visiting Millennium Park had become a quiet comfort. Each day, he would stop by Matthew's flower stand, buy a bouquet, and spend a few minutes chatting with the young man. Their conversations were simple: how business was going, how cold the mornings were, but each exchange brought them closer. Whitaker cherished these moments, even as he wrestled with the growing weight of the truth he carried. The decision to keep the truth from Matthew, for now, was one Whitaker revisited constantly. He wanted to tell the boy, wanted to say the words that had been building in his chest since James Miller's investigation confirmed their connection. But each time he tried to imagine the conversation, his mind filled with doubts. How would he react? Would he reject me? Would he even believe me? One cold afternoon, as Whitaker stood at the flower stand, Matthew handed him a bouquet of chrysanthemums. "Here you go, sir," the boy said with a smile. "These are perfect for winter. They last longer in the cold." Whitaker accepted the flowers, his hands lingering on the paper wrapping as he searched for the right words. "Matthew," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can I ask you something personal?" Matthew's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Sure." Whitaker hesitated, then gestured toward the locket around Matthew's neck. "That pendant. It must mean a lot to you." Matthew's hand instinctively went to the locket, his fingers brushing over the smooth silver. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's the only thing I have from my mom. She always wore it. Said it was her lucky charm." Whitaker felt a lump form in his throat. "Do you know much about her?" he asked gently. "What kind of person she was?" Matthew shrugged, his gaze dropping to the flowers on the stand. "Not really. I was young when she died. I remember little things. Her voice, her smile. But most of what I know is from Helen. She said my mom was kind and hardworking. Strong, too." Whitaker nodded, his chest tightening at the boy's words. "She was," he said softly. Before he could stop himself, Matthew looked up, confused. "You knew her?" Whitaker froze, realizing his slip. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, but the earnest curiosity in Matthew's eyes stopped him. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. I did," he admitted. "A long time ago." Matthew's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and suspicion crossing his face. "How?" Whitaker hesitated, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "It's complicated," he said finally, "but I promise, I'll explain everything. Just not here. Not now." Matthew's jaw tightened, but he didn't press further. "Okay," he said after a moment, though his tone was wary. "I guess I can wait." That evening, Whitaker sat in his study, staring at the chrysanthemums on his desk. His conversation with Matthew replayed in his mind, each word adding to the turmoil in his chest. He knew he couldn't keep the truth from the boy much longer. The longer he waited, the harder it would be to explain, as he wrestled with his thoughts. His phone buzzed. It was James Miller. Whitaker answered quickly, grateful for the distraction. "Charles?" Miller began, his tone calm but serious. "I've been looking into the property records you asked about. Setting up a flower shop won't be too complicated. But there's one location that might interest you. It's a small space near Millennium Park. Good foot traffic, affordable rent." Whitaker's heart lifted slightly at the news. "That's perfect," he said. "I want to move forward with it, quietly." "Understood," Miller replied. "I'll handle the paperwork." After ending the call, Whitaker felt a sense of purpose. Helping Matthew open his own shop wasn't just about giving him a chance. It was about showing him that he believed in him. But even as he planned the next steps, the weight of his secret loomed over him. He couldn't delay the truth any longer. The following day, Whitaker returned to the park, determined to take the first step. Matthew greeted him with his usual smile, though there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Morning, sir," Matthew said. "Back for more flowers." Whitaker managed a faint smile. "Always," he replied, picking up a bouquet of lilies. As Matthew began to wrap the flowers, Whitaker cleared his throat. "Matthew, do you have time to grab a coffee after this?" Matthew paused, looking up with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Coffee?" Whitaker nodded. "I'd like to talk to you, somewhere quieter." Matthew hesitated, studying Whitaker's face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, just let me finish up here." An hour later, they sat in a small cafe near the park, the warm air a welcome relief from the winter chill. Whitaker sipped his coffee, gathering his thoughts as Matthew watched him expectantly. "So," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "What's this about?" Whitaker set his cup down, his hands trembling slightly. "Matthew," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I've been coming to your stand for a reason, not just for the flowers." Matthew's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Whitaker took a deep breath, meeting the boy's gaze. "I believe," "I'm your grandfather." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Matthew blinked, his expression unreadable as he processed what he had just heard. Matthew stared at Charles Whitaker, his coffee untouched and cooling on the table. The cafe around them seemed to fade into the background as the young man processed the weight of Whitaker's words. The claim was so unexpected, so impossible, that it almost felt like a cruel joke. "You're my grandfather," Matthew finally said, his voice low but sharp with disbelief. Whitaker nodded, his expression earnest. "Yes, Matthew, your mother, Emily, was my daughter." Matthew blinked, his brow furrowing as he leaned back in his chair. "Emily," he echoed. "That was my mom's name. But how do you know that? How do I know this isn't just some weird mistake?" Whitaker leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I understand this must be overwhelming," he said gently, "and I don't expect you to believe me right away. But I've done my research. I know she was your mother. I know she gave you that locket, the same one I gave her when she was 16. Matthew instinctively touched the locket around his neck, his fingers brushing the cool silver. His expression shifted, doubt battling with the faintest hint of hope. "She never talked about her family," he said, his voice quieter now. "Helen always said my mom kept her past private." Whitaker's face darkened with guilt. "That's my fault," he admitted. "Emily and we didn't part on good terms. She left because of me, because I pushed her too hard. I've regretted it every day since." Matthew studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "So, you just show up now, after all this time? Why?" His voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables. "Why didn't you try to find her before?" Whitaker's chest tightened. "I did," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I searched for her, but I never found her. And when I finally learned the truth, that she had passed, it was too late." Matthew's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on the table. "So now you're here because you feel guilty. Is that it? You think you can just... what? Make it up to her by showing up in my life?" Whitaker exhaled slowly, struggling to maintain his composure. "I'm here because you're my grandson," he said firmly, "and because I want to know you, to support you, if you'll let me." Matthew shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and confusion. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. "I don't even know you. How am I supposed to just accept this?" Whitaker reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was an old picture of Emily as a teenager, her bright smile frozen in time. He slid it across the table toward Matthew. "This is your mother," he said softly. Matthew hesitated before picking up the photo. His eyes widened slightly as he studied it, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn paper. "She looks younger," he murmured. "But it's her." Whitaker nodded, his throat tightening. "She was about your age when that photo was taken. She had so much life ahead of her, so much potential." Matthew's gaze lingered on the photograph for a long moment before he set it down, his expression guarded. "Even if this is true," he said carefully, "what do you want from me? I've been fine on my own. I don't need a family now." Whitaker swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't want anything from you, Matthew," he said. "I just want to be here for you. I know I've already failed once with Emily, but maybe I can do something right this time." Matthew leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "This is a lot to take in," he said bluntly. "I mean, how do I even know you're telling the truth?" "I'll prove it to you," Whitaker said without hesitation. "Whatever you need, DNA tests, more records, I'll provide it. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. All I'm asking for is a chance." Matthew fell silent, his eyes fixed on the photograph as he mulled over Whitaker's words. The cafe seemed to grow quieter, the hum of conversations around them fading into the background. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "I need time to think," he said simply. Whitaker nodded, relief mingling with the ache in his chest. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here when you're ready." Matthew stood, tucking the photograph into his jacket pocket. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, before turning and walking out of the cafe, leaving Whitaker alone at the table. As Whitaker sat in the emptying cafe, he stared at the empty chair across from him, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had known it wouldn't be easy, had prepared himself for resistance. But hearing the doubt and hurt in Matthew's voice cut deeper than he expected. Still, he reminded himself, this was only the beginning. Matthew hadn't rejected him outright, and that small sliver of hope was enough to keep him going. Whitaker reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph, this one of Emily as a child. He smiled faintly, the memory of her laughter echoing in his mind. "I won't give up," he murmured to himself, his voice resolute. Not this time. Matthew walked briskly down the street after leaving the cafe, the photograph of his mother tucked securely in his jacket pocket. His breath formed small clouds in the chilly air as he tried to make sense of everything Charles Whitaker had told him. The older man's words swirled in his mind, clashing with years of uncertainty and pain. "My grandfather," he thought, his steps quickening. How could that be true? Matthew slowed as he approached his small apartment, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing the locket around his neck for as long as he could remember. It had been a symbol of his mother, her love, her sacrifice. But now it felt heavier, as though the weight of its history had doubled overnight. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and dropped his bag on the worn couch. The room was cold and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within him. Sitting down, Matthew pulled out the photograph Whitaker had given him. He studied it closely, his eyes tracing the young woman's features. She looked happy, vibrant, so different from the fleeting memories he had of her. Yet there was no denying it. This was his mother, and the man who had given him this photo claimed to be her father. Matthew leaned back, running a hand through his hair. The idea was absurd, wasn't it? He had spent his entire life believing he had no family beyond Helen, the woman who had raised him after his mother's death. And now, out of nowhere, this stranger appeared, claiming to be connected to him by blood. It was too much to process. Meanwhile, Charles Whitaker sat in his study, staring at the same photograph he had shown Matthew. His mind replayed their conversation, dissecting every word, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion on Matthew's face. The boy hadn't rejected him outright, which was a small victory, but the lingering doubt in his eyes haunted Whitaker. Whitaker reached for his notebook, flipping through pages of scribbled plans and ideas. He had already asked James Miller to secure the space for the flower shop, a step he hoped would show Matthew that he believed in him. But as much as he wanted to help, Whitaker knew that actions alone wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap between them. For the first time in years, Whitaker felt uncertain, unsure of how to move forward without pushing too hard or saying the wrong thing. He had spent decades navigating high-stakes negotiations and making billion-dollar decisions. Yet here he was, fumbling to connect with his own grandson. The irony wasn't lost on him. The next day, Matthew returned to the flower stand, his movements slower than usual as he set up his display. The weight of the previous day's conversation hung heavy on him, and his usual energy seemed dimmed. As he arranged the bouquets, he kept glancing at the locket, his thoughts churning. "Morning, Matthew," a familiar voice called out. Matthew looked up to see Whitaker standing nearby, his hands tucked into the pockets of his overcoat. He felt a twinge of annoyance at the sight of the older man but pushed it aside. "Morning," he replied, his tone neutral. Whitaker approached the stand, his eyes scanning the flowers. "How's business today?" he asked, keeping his voice light. "Slow," Matthew admitted, gesturing to the empty park. "Not many people out in this cold." Whitaker nodded, then picked up a bouquet of sunflowers. "I'll take these," he said, handing over the payment. Matthew wrapped the flowers quickly, his hands steady despite the tension he felt. "Here you go," he said, passing the bouquet to Whitaker. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until Whitaker finally broke it. "I know yesterday was a lot," he said carefully. "I don't want to overwhelm you, Matthew. I just wanted to check in." Matthew's jaw tightened. "You don't have to check in," he said bluntly. "I'm fine." Whitaker studied him, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you are," he said after a moment. "But I meant what I said. I'm here if you need anything." Matthew didn't respond. Instead, focusing on rearranging the flowers on the stand, Whitaker lingered for a moment longer before nodding. "Take care, Matthew," he said quietly, before turning to leave. As Whitaker walked away, Matthew watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling in his chest, Part of him wanted to tell the older man to stop coming, to leave him alone. But another part, a small, uncertain part, felt something else. A flicker of curiosity, maybe even hope. That evening, Matthew sat at his small kitchen table, the photograph of his mother lying in front of him. He stared at it for a long time, his mind replaying fragments of memories. Her laughter, her hands brushing his hair, the way she used to hum while she cooked. He had so many questions he had never thought he'd have the chance to ask anyone. Finally, he picked up his phone and dialed the number Whitaker had given him. It rang twice before the older man answered. "Matthew," Whitaker said, his voice warm but cautious. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." Matthew hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. "I've been thinking," he said, "if what you're saying is true, if you really are my grandfather, I need proof." "Of course," Whitaker replied without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes to show you." Matthew nodded, though the older man couldn't see it. "Good," he said simply, "because I'm not just going to take your word for it." "You shouldn't," Whitaker said gently. "You deserve the truth, Matthew, and I'll give it to you." As Matthew hung up, he felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to take control of it. The following days were marked by an uneasy tension between Charles Whitaker and Matthew. Their interactions at the flower stand continued, but the air between them carried an unspoken weight. Whitaker, ever cautious, resisted the urge to push Matthew for more than he was ready to give. Meanwhile, Matthew wrestled with a storm of emotions: curiosity, doubt, and a lingering sense of betrayal for the years of silence from a man claiming to be family. One cold morning, as Matthew finished setting up his display, Whitaker approached as usual. This time, however, he carried a folder under his arm, his expression serious yet calm. "Morning, Matthew," Whitaker said, his tone gentle but steady. Matthew looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the folder. "Morning," he replied, his voice cool. Whitaker hesitated for a moment before holding out the folder. "I brought this for you," he said. "It's some of the proof you asked for. Records, photographs, documents. I thought it might help answer some of your questions." Matthew eyed the folder warily before taking it. "Thanks," he said, though his tone was guarded. Whitaker nodded. "Take your time with it. If you have any questions, I'm here." Matthew placed the folder under the counter, clearly not ready to dive into its contents just yet. "I'll look at it later," he said curtly. Whitaker nodded again, sensing that pushing further would only backfire. "Of course," he said. "I'll leave you to your work." As Whitaker walked away, Matthew couldn't help but glance at the folder again. It sat there like a challenge, daring him to open it, but he wasn't ready, at least not yet. That evening, after closing up the flower stand, Matthew returned to his apartment, the folder tucked under his arm. He set it on the small kitchen table, staring at it for a long moment before finally sitting down and opening it. Inside were neatly organized pages, a copy of his mother's birth certificate, old family photos, and even a handwritten letter from Whitaker explaining his regret and the steps he had taken to find Emily after she left. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, each piece of evidence chipping away at his skepticism. The photographs hit him the hardest. There was Emily, younger and full of life, her smile radiating a joy that Matthew had only glimpsed in his early memories of her. And there, standing beside her in some of the photos, was Whitaker, stern but proud, his hand resting on her shoulder. It was undeniable. The man who had been buying flowers from him every day was, in fact, his grandfather. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He felt a pang of anger at Whitaker for not finding them sooner, for letting Emily struggle alone. But he also felt something else, an ache of understanding, a flicker of empathy, for a man who clearly carried his own burden of guilt. The next morning, Whitaker was preparing to leave his penthouse when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Matthew. "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe this afternoon." Whitaker's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time Matthew had reached out to him directly, and though the message was brief, it carried a weight that Whitaker couldn't ignore. He replied quickly, confirming the time. When Whitaker arrived at the cafe, Matthew was already there. Sitting at a corner table with a coffee in front of him, he looked up as Whitaker approached, his expression unreadable. "Matthew," Whitaker greeted, taking the seat across from him. "Thank you for meeting me." Matthew nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the side of his cup. "I went through the folder," he said without preamble. "It's a lot to process." "I understand," Whitaker said carefully. "Take all the time you need." Matthew exhaled sharply, his eyes meeting Whitaker's. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did it take you this long to show up?" Whitaker's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of the question. "Because I didn't know," he admitted. "I didn't know about you until recently. If I had known earlier, I would have done everything in my power to be there for you and your mother." Matthew studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. "She never talked about you," he said. "Helen said my mom kept her past a secret." Whitaker nodded, his gaze steady. "She had every reason to," he said quietly. "When she left, it was because I pushed her too hard. I tried to control her life, thinking I was helping, but I wasn't. And when she walked away, I lost the chance to make it right." Matthew leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So now you're trying to make it right with me?" "Yes," Whitaker said simply. "I know I can't change the past, and I know I've already failed you in so many ways. But if there's any way I can be part of your life now, I want to try." The sincerity in Whitaker's voice caught Matthew off guard. He looked down at his coffee, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Part of him wanted to tell Whitaker to leave him alone, to walk away and never come back. But another part, a quieter, more vulnerable part, wanted to believe that this connection could mean something. Finally, Matthew looked up. "I'm not saying I trust you," he said slowly, "but I'm willing to give you a chance." Whitaker's chest tightened, a wave of relief washing over him. "That's all I could ask for," he said. "Thank you." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days following Matthew's cautious acceptance of Charles Whitaker were marked by small but significant shifts. Their interactions at the flower stand became less tense, the conversations a little warmer, though always with a hint of reserve on Matthew's part. Whitaker didn't push. He understood the fragility of the progress they'd made and was determined not to jeopardize it. One particularly cold morning, Whitaker arrived at the stand with his usual steady stride. Matthew greeted him with a nod, his hands busy arranging a display of roses. "Morning, sir," he said, his tone more natural than it had been in weeks. "Morning, Matthew," Whitaker replied, glancing at the neatly arranged flowers. "Business seems to be picking up." Matthew shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "People like flowers in the winter, I guess. Something about color in all the gray." Whitaker nodded, appreciating the sentiment. "That's a good way to think about it. You've got a knack for bringing beauty into the everyday." Matthew chuckled softly, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I don't know about that, but I try." Whitaker hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Would you have time to grab lunch today, my treat?" Matthew paused, his expression guarded as he considered the offer. After a moment, he nodded. "Sure. I can close up for a bit around noon." "Good," Whitaker said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll meet you here." At noon, the two men walked to a small diner not far from the park. It was a cozy, unassuming place, with red vinyl booths and the smell of coffee lingering in the air. They took a seat by the window, where sunlight streamed in despite the cold outside. The waitress approached, taking their orders, soup and sandwiches for both. Once she left, an awkward silence settled between them. Whitaker broke it first. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his tone sincere, "for giving me a chance. I know this hasn't been easy for you." Matthew stirred his coffee, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "It's not easy," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life thinking I didn't have anyone. Then you show up, and it's a lot." Whitaker nodded, his hands clasped on the table. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this must feel," he said. "But I want you to know I'm here for you, whatever you need." "However I can help." Matthew looked up, meeting Whitaker's eyes. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "You didn't even know I existed until a few weeks ago." Whitaker exhaled slowly, his expression softening. "Because you're family, Matthew," he said simply. And because I failed Emily, I let her walk away, and I've regretted it every day since. I don't want to make the same mistake with you." Matthew studied him, his expression unreadable. "It's weird," he said after a moment, "thinking of you as family. I've been on my own for so long. It's hard to wrap my head around it." "I understand," Whitaker said gently. "And I don't expect this to happen overnight. I'm willing to take it one step at a time, at your pace." The waitress returned with their food, breaking the tension momentarily. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of silverware filling the gaps in their conversation. But as the meal progressed, Matthew began to relax, the initial awkwardness giving way to something more natural. After lunch, the two men walked back to the park, the cold air biting at their faces. Whitaker glanced at Matthew as they walked, noting the way the young man seemed more at ease. It was a small victory, but one Whitaker cherished nonetheless. As they reached the flower stand, Matthew paused, turning to face Whitaker. "Thanks for lunch," he said, his tone sincere. "It was nice." Whitaker smiled, the warmth in his expression genuine. "It was my pleasure. We should do it again sometime." Matthew nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, maybe." Whitaker hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this," he said, holding it out to Matthew. "It's something I've been working on. Take a look when you have time." Matthew took the envelope, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "What is it?" "Just an idea," Whitaker said cryptically. "Let me know what you think." With that, he gave Matthew a nod and walked away, leaving the young man standing by the flower stand, the envelope clutched in his hand. That evening, Matthew sat at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope. After a moment's hesitation, he opened it, pulling out a series of papers. His eyes widened as he scanned the documents. A detailed plan for a flower shop, complete with sketches of the layout, cost estimates, and potential locations. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note. "Matthew, I know this might feel sudden, but I wanted to show you that I believe in you. This isn't just a gesture. It's a chance for you to build something of your own. If you're interested, I'd like to help you make it happen. The decision is yours." Charles Matthew set the papers down, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and the lingering hesitation that had shadowed him since Whitaker entered his life. But as he stared at the plans, a small spark of hope began to take root. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might be possible. Not just a flower shop, but a future that felt bigger, brighter, and more connected than anything he had dared to dream before. Matthew couldn't sleep that night. The plans Whitaker had given him were spread across his small kitchen table, illuminated by the soft glow of the single overhead bulb. He had read through them twice, each detail meticulously laid out. It wasn't just an idea, it was a complete vision for his dream flower shop, one he hadn't dared to think could become a reality. The handwritten note at the bottom of the stack lingered in his mind. "I believe in you." Those words carried a weight Matthew wasn't sure how to process. He had spent so much of his life relying on himself, shouldering the burden of his dreams and challenges alone. To have someone else, especially someone like Whitaker, offer their support was both exhilarating and unsettling. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through his window, Matthew finally made up his mind. He folded the plans carefully and tucked them into his bag. It was time to have a serious conversation with Whitaker. Later that morning, Whitaker was sitting in his study, sipping his usual black coffee and reviewing notes for another meeting with James Miller. He had been mulling over potential locations for the flower shop, trying to anticipate any obstacles Matthew might face. The sound of his phone vibrating on the desk interrupted his thoughts. It was a text from Matthew. "Can we meet? Same cafe as last time. Noon?" Whitaker's heart lifted as he quickly replied, "I'll be there. At exactly noon." Whitaker arrived at the cafe to find Matthew already seated, a cup of coffee in front of him. The young man looked more focused than usual, his expression serious but not closed off. Whitaker approached with cautious optimism, taking the seat across from him. "Thanks for meeting me," Matthew said, his tone neutral but polite. "Of course," Whitaker replied. "I'm glad you reached out." Matthew hesitated for a moment before pulling the folded plans from his bag and placing them on the table. "I went through these," he said, his fingers drumming lightly on the paper. "It's a lot." Whitaker nodded, his expression careful. I wanted to show you what's possible, but it's just a starting point. Nothing is set in stone. Matthew studied him, his brow furrowing slightly. Why are you doing this? He asked. Why do you care so much about me having a flower shop? Whitaker leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Because I see potential in you, Matthew, he said earnestly. You have talent, passion, and a vision, and I want to help you turn that vision into something real. Matthew's jaw tightened, his skepticism still evident. But why? You barely know me. Whitaker exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. You're right. I don't know you as well as I'd like, but I want to change that. This isn't just about the shop. It's about building something together. I missed my chance to be there for Emily, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But with you, I have a chance to do things differently. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. What if I say no? He asked. What if I don't want your help? Whitaker met his eyes without hesitation. Then I'll respect that, he said. This is your life, your decision. I'm not here to force anything on you. I just want you to know that I'm here if you need me. The honesty in Whitaker's voice caught Matthew off guard. For weeks, he had been expecting the older man to push too hard, to try to control the situation like so many others had in the past. But Whitaker's willingness to step back, to let Matthew lead, was something entirely different. I don't know what to think, Matthew admitted, his voice quieter now. This is all so sudden, and it feels too good to be true. Whitaker smiled faintly. I understand, he said. It's a big leap, and it's okay to be unsure. All I'm asking is that you think about it. Take your time. Matthew nodded, his fingers brushing over the edge of the plans. I will, he said, but I can't promise anything. That's all I ask, Whitaker replied, his tone warm. Over the next few days, Matthew carried the plans with him wherever he went, glancing at them whenever he had a spare moment. The more he looked, the more the idea began to take root in his mind. He imagined the layout of the shop, the smell of fresh flowers greeting customers as they walked in, the satisfaction of building something that was truly his. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, Matthew made a decision. He reached for his phone and dialed Whitaker's number. Matthew. Whitaker answered almost immediately, his voice calm but hopeful. I've been thinking, Matthew said, his tone steady. If we do this, if we try to open the shop, I need it to be on my terms, no strings attached. No expectations. Whitaker didn't hesitate. Agreed, he said. This is your dream, Matthew. I'm just here to support you. Matthew exhaled, the weight on his chest easing slightly. Okay, he said. Then let's try. Whitaker smiled, relief flooding through him. I'm proud of you, Matthew, he said softly. This is going to be something incredible. Matthew allowed himself a small smile in return. I guess we'll see. As the call ended, both men felt a renewed sense of purpose. For Whitaker, it was a chance to honor Emily's memory by supporting her son. For Matthew, it was an opportunity to take control of his future. And for both of them, it was the beginning of something new, a fragile but growing bond that might just change both their lives. The morning air was crisp as Charles Whitaker and Matthew stood in front of the small shop near Millennium Park. The building was modest but inviting, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light, and a simple sign above the door that read, For lease. For Matthew, it felt surreal, standing on the threshold of something that had only ever been a distant dream. Whitaker handed Matthew a set of keys, his expression calm but encouraging. It's all yours, he said. Take a look inside. Matthew hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Unlocking the door and pushing it open, the interior was empty, the floors scuffed and the walls in need of a fresh coat of paint, but Matthew could already see its potential. He walked slowly through the space, his mind racing with ideas. This is bigger than I imagined, he said, his voice tinged with both awe and nervousness. Whitaker followed behind him, hands in his pockets. It's a blank canvas, he said. You can make it whatever you want it to be. Matthew turned to face him, his brow furrowed. You've done so much already. Are you sure about this? Whitaker smiled faintly. I'm sure. This is your dream, Matthew. I'm just here to help you bring it to life. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Matthew began transforming the shop. Whitaker had connected him with contractors and suppliers, but Matthew insisted on being involved in every step of the process. He spent long hours painting the walls, assembling shelves, and carefully planning the layout. Each decision felt deeply personal, a reflection of his vision and hard work. Whitaker visited the shop often, offering support and advice when needed, but always careful not to overstep. He admired Matthew's determination, the way he threw himself into the project with unwavering focus. It reminded Whitaker of Emily, her stubbornness, her passion, her refusal to settle for anything less than her best. One afternoon, as Matthew was arranging a delivery of potted plants near the front window, Whitaker walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a break," he said. Setting one of the cups on the counter, Matthew wiped his hands on a rag before taking the coffee. "Thanks," he said, his tone more relaxed than it had been in their earlier interactions. Whitaker glanced around the shop, taking in the progress. The walls were now a soft, welcoming shade of green. The shelves neatly organized with vases, ribbons, and tools. Flowers in every color imaginable filled the space, their scent mingling with the faint aroma of fresh paint. "You've done an incredible job," Whitaker said, his voice full of genuine admiration. Matthew shrugged, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "It's coming together," he admitted. "Still a lot to do, though." Whitaker nodded. "True, but you've come a long way. You should be proud of yourself." Matthew took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting to the window. "I never thought this would actually happen," he said quietly. "It's strange." "Good, but strange." Whitaker studied him, sensing the mix of emotions beneath his words. "It's okay to feel that way," he said. "Big changes are always a little overwhelming, but you've earned this, Matthew. You deserve to see your dreams come to life." Matthew didn't respond right away, but his expression softened. "Thanks," he said after a moment. "For everything." Whitaker smiled, the warmth in his expression unmistakable. "You're welcome." As the opening day of the shop approached, Matthew's nervous energy grew. He double-checked every detail, from the placement of the flower arrangements to the design of the shop's sign, which now proudly read, "Bloom of Hope." The name had come to him one evening, as he sat alone in the shop, reflecting on how far he had come. It felt fitting, a tribute to his mother's strength, and a reminder of the hope that had brought him here. Whitaker was there on the eve of the opening, helping Matthew with the final preparations. The 2 men worked side by side, arranging displays and tidying the space. As they stood back to admire their work, a sense of quiet accomplishment filled the air. "It's perfect," Whitaker said, his voice filled with pride. Matthew nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "What if no one comes?" he asked, the vulnerability in his tone catching Whitaker off guard. Whitaker placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They'll come," he said firmly. "You've put your heart into this, and people will see that. Trust me." Matthew exhaled slowly, nodding again. "I hope you're right." "I am," Whitaker said with a small smile. "And even if the start is slow, we'll figure it out. Together." That night, as Matthew locked up the shop, he stood outside for a moment, staring at the sign, "Bloom of Hope." The words felt more meaningful now than ever before. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just a flower vendor anymore. He was a business owner, someone with a future he could be proud of, and for the first time, he felt truly connected to his past. Whitaker's presence in his life was still new and complicated, but it was no longer something he wanted to push away. It was something he was beginning to accept. Slowly, cautiously, but genuinely. As Matthew walked home that night, the crisp winter air biting at his cheeks, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. Tomorrow was the start of something new, and for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. The morning of the grand opening dawned crisp and clear, the winter sun casting a golden glow over the city. Matthew arrived at Bloom of Hope earlier than he ever had, the keys jangling nervously in his hand. His heart raced as he unlocked the door, stepping inside the shop that had consumed his thoughts and efforts for weeks. The air was filled with the mingling scents of roses, daisies, and lilies, each bouquet meticulously arranged in displays that lined the walls. Potted plants sat by the large windows, their vibrant greens adding a sense of life to the space. The sign on the door read "Open," its letters bold and inviting. Matthew took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he began the final preparations. The till was ready. The cards for custom orders were neatly stacked, and the promotional flyers Whitaker had helped design sat by the counter, their cheerful colors promising discounts for first-day customers. The sound of the door opening behind him made him turn. Whitaker stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee in a paper bag. "Figured you could use some breakfast," he said, placing the items on the counter. Matthew managed a small smile, his nerves evident. "Thanks. I didn't think I'd eat this morning." Whitaker chuckled softly. "It's normal to feel this way, but trust me, once those first customers walk in, it'll all fall into place." Matthew nodded, though his doubt lingered. "I hope so." Whitaker placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've worked hard for this, Matthew. You're ready." As the clock struck 9, the first customers began to trickle in. An older woman came in for a bouquet of roses, chatting warmly with Matthew about her granddaughter's upcoming birthday. A young couple entered soon after, picking out sunflowers for their kitchen. Each interaction seemed to ease Matthew's nerves, his confidence growing with every sale. Whitaker watched from a corner of the shop, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Matthew's natural charm and genuine passion shone through with every customer he served, and Whitaker couldn't help but see glimpses of Emily in him. The same warmth, the same quiet strength. By midday, the shop was bustling. Word had spread quickly, thanks to the flyers and a few well-placed social media posts. A steady stream of customers flowed in and out, the till ringing frequently as Matthew worked tirelessly behind the counter. Despite the chaos, his smile never wavered. At one point, Whitaker noticed a young woman standing near the window, admiring a display of lilies. She seemed hesitant, her hands fiddling with the strap of her bag. Whitaker approached her with a warm smile. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. The woman looked up, startled before smiling shyly. "Oh, I'm just looking. This place is beautiful." "Thank you," Whitaker said. "It's all Matthew's work." Her smile widened. "He's done an amazing job. You must be proud." Whitaker hesitated, the weight of her words catching him off guard. "I am," he said softly. "More than I can say." As the afternoon gave way to evening, the pace of the shop began to slow. The last few customers trickled out, leaving Matthew and Whitaker alone in the quiet space. The young man leaned against the counter, exhaustion etched into his features, but a smile on his face. "That was incredible," Matthew said, his voice filled with a mix of amazement and relief. "I can't believe how many people showed up." Whitaker chuckled, leaning against a nearby shelf. "You did it, Matthew. You brought this place to life." Matthew looked around the shop, his eyes taking in every detail. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "Thank you for believing in me." Whitaker's chest tightened at the sincerity in Matthew's voice. "You didn't need me to believe in you," he said. "You've had it in you all along. I just gave you a little push." Matthew smiled faintly, the weight of his gratitude evident in his expression. "Still, it means a lot." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the shop settling over them. Whitaker couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment, not just for helping Matthew achieve his dream, but for finally feeling connected to his family in a way he hadn't in years. As they prepared to close up for the night, Matthew walked over to the door and flipped the sign to closed. He turned back to Whitaker, his expression more open than it had been since they first met. "This place feels right," Matthew said, "like it's the start of something new." Whitaker nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "It is," he said, "for both of us." Matthew hesitated, then extended a hand. Whitaker looked at it for a moment before taking it, the handshake firm and meaningful. "Thank you, Charles," Matthew said quietly, using his name for the first time. Whitaker's smile softened, his voice steady as he replied, "Call me Grandpa." Matthew's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face before a smile broke through. "All right, Grandpa." The word hung in the air, carrying with it a sense of belonging neither of them had felt in years. As they locked up the shop and stepped out into the cold night, the bond between them felt stronger, more real. It wasn't just a shop they had built. It was a bridge, connecting their pasts and shaping a shared future. The weeks following the grand opening of Bloom of Hope were transformative for both Matthew and Charles Whitaker. The shop quickly became a fixture in the neighborhood, drawing in regular customers who were charmed by Matthew's warmth and the vibrant beauty of his creations. Every bouquet, every arrangement told a story of care and passion, and the community responded with enthusiasm. For Matthew, the shop was more than a business. It was a symbol of growth and possibility. Each day, as he unlocked the doors and welcomed customers, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. And while the initial nerves lingered, he embraced the challenges with a quiet determination that reminded Whitaker so much of Emily. Whitaker, too, found himself transformed. He had spent decades chasing wealth and success, but it was here, in the cozy flower shop, that he discovered something far more valuable: connection. Watching Matthew thrive, seeing the boy's cautious trust evolve into genuine warmth, filled a void Whitaker had carried for years. One quiet afternoon, the shop was empty, and Matthew was behind the counter, carefully arranging a bouquet of daisies and tulips. Whitaker sat nearby, sipping a cup of tea and flipping through a newspaper. The atmosphere was calm, the kind of peaceful moment both men had come to cherish. "Business is steady," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "I didn't think it would take off this fast." Whitaker looked up, a small smile on his face. "You underestimated yourself," he said. "People can see the heart you put into this place. That's why they keep coming back." Matthew hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter. "It's more than just me," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have been able to do this without you." Whitaker set down his cup, his expression softening. "You've given me more than I've given you," he said. "This shop, this time we've spent together, it's helped me feel connected again. To Emily, to you, to something real." Matthew met his gaze, a flicker of emotion passing through his eyes. "I guess we've both been missing something," he said. "But I'm glad you're here now." Whitaker smiled, the simple words meaning more to him than Matthew could have known. "Me too," he said softly, as the months went by. The bond between Matthew and Whitaker deepened. They shared meals, worked together in the shop, and even began to talk about the past. Memories of Emily, stories of Whitaker's younger years, and the challenges both men had faced in their lives. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest. And with each one, the walls between them continued to come down. One evening, as they closed up the shop, Whitaker handed Matthew a small wrapped box. "What's this?" Matthew asked, raising an eyebrow. "Open it and see," Whitaker said, his tone light but expectant. Matthew unwrapped the box to reveal a sleek leather-bound journal. On the first page, written in Whitaker's neat handwriting, was a simple inscription: "For Matthew, to capture your dreams and the stories you'll create along the way." Matthew ran his fingers over the smooth cover, his chest tightening. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Whitaker replied. "Just promise me you'll use it." Matthew nodded, his voice quiet. "I will, thank you." As spring approached, Bloom of Hope became a hub for the community. Customers came not just for the flowers, but for the warmth and authenticity that Matthew and Whitaker had cultivated. The shop hosted small events, floral arrangement workshops, community fundraisers, and even a celebration honoring Emily's memory. During one of these events, Whitaker stood by the window, watching as Matthew spoke to a group of customers. His face animated as he demonstrated how to create a simple bouquet. Whitaker's heart swelled with pride. This was Emily's legacy. Alive and thriving in the sun she had loved so fiercely. One of the customers, an older woman who had become a regular, approached Whitaker with a smile. "You must be so proud of him," she said. Whitaker nodded, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I am," he said. "More than I can say." One evening, after the shop had closed and the city had quieted, Matthew and Whitaker sat together in the back room, sharing a simple dinner. The conversation drifted to the past, as it often did, but this time, it felt lighter, less burdened by pain and regret. "Do you ever think about what Emily would say if she could see us now?" Matthew asked, his tone thoughtful. Whitaker smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "I think she'd be happy," he said. "Proud of you, and maybe a little surprised that I managed to get something right." Matthew chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "I think she'd be proud of you too," he said. for trying, for being here. Whitaker's eyes met Matthew's. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The bond between them spoke louder than words as they stepped outside to lock up for the night. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above the city. Matthew looked up, his breath visible in the cool air. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "This shop isn't just about flowers, it's about hope, about starting over." Whitaker nodded, his gaze following Matthew's. "It is," he said, "and it's just the beginning." Matthew turned to him, a small but genuine smile on his face. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said softly, the word carrying a weight of trust and acceptance that Whitaker hadn't dared to hope for. Whitaker's chest tightened, his own smile breaking through. "Thank you, Matthew," he replied, his voice filled with pride, "for letting me be part of this." As they stood there side by side, the light from the shop's sign illuminating the street, it was clear that Bloom of Hope wasn't just a business. It was a testament to the power of connection, redemption, and the enduring strength of family.